Welcome everyone to the latest episode of GrowthChat. Today we are super delighted to welcome Oded Galor. He's the Herbert Goldberger Professor of Economics at Brown University. And today it's a novel step in our journey that we will be talking about a book. And Oded has just written an amazing book, I think, with the title, The Journey of Humankind, The Origins of Wealth and Inequality. And the book is now finally available on Amazon and will also come out in print in the next few days. So you should hurry to get a copy for yourselves. So to get us going, Oded, maybe you could summarize for us, what is your book all about?
Thank you very much, Sascha. It's really a pleasure to be on your GrowthChat. And so let me start indeed with the explanation about the journey of humanity. So the journey of humanity, the title of the book, explores the evolution of societies since the emergence of an anatomically modern human in Africa nearly 300,000 years ago. And it focuses on two fundamental mysteries that surrounds this journey. The first one is the mystery of growth, namely, what are the roots of the dramatic transformation in living standards in the past centuries after hundreds of thousands of years of stagnation? And the second one is the mystery of inequality, namely, what is the origin of the vast inequality in the wealth of nations? Now, over most of human existence, as you know, human life was nasty, brutish, and short. It was remarkably similar to that of any other species. Humans were preoccupied by survival and reproduction. Living standards were near subsistence, and there were minor differences in living standards across time and across space. But then, over the past 2 centuries, we see this major metamorphosis, dramatic transformation in living standards within and across societies. Income per capita in the world increased 14-fold. Life expectancy has more than doubled, and a great divergence took place in income per capita across countries and regions of the world. To illustrate this idea, consider for a moment a resident of Jerusalem at the time of Jesus in the 1st century, Roman Jerusalem, and whisk this individual in a time machine nearly 2,000 years forward to Ottoman Jerusalem in the 19th century. Despite this large jump of 2,000 years, this individual will be able to adjust instantaneously to the new environment. Past knowledge would be largely applicable. Technological improvements would be merely incremental. Occupations would require very similar skills, and life expectancy would remain largely unchanged. But if you take this individual and you whisk this individual again 200 years forward, from Jerusalem of the 19th century to contemporary Jerusalem, this will be a shocking experience, a devastating experience. Past knowledge will be largely obsolete. Modern technologies would appear as a witchcraft. Occupations would require incomprehensible skills, and life expectancy would double and would require future-oriented mindset, education decision, saving decisions, life cycle decisions. So in contrast to the conventional wisdom, living standard does not increase gradually in the course of human history. Technological progress accelerated gradually over time, but it had a negligible impact on living standard in the course of human history. In fact, the recent rise in living standards reflect a phase transition, an abrupt transformation once a tipping point has been reached. So if we want to resolve these fundamental mysteries, the mystery of inequality and the mystery of growth, we need to have a better identification of the forces that permitted the transition from stagnation to growth, the forces that led into the differential timing of the transition from stagnation to growth across the globe, and we have to have a better identification of the role of historical and prehistorical forces in this process. And this resolution will ultimately provide us with important insights about the design of strategies that could mitigate inequality across the globe. And as a result of it, we really need to think about the process of development in its entirety. Much of the inequality that we see across the globe today was originated in the past 200 years, and much of the differential takeoff from stagnation to growth is originated because of deep-rooted factors that permitted some societies to take off early and others to take off late. And given the fact that this takeoff was associated with a 14-fold increase in income per capita, this generated an enormous diversity in the standard of living across societies. But when we think about the process of development, typically we would segment the process of development into three fundamental phases. The Malthusian Epoch that lasted over 99.9% of human existence, the post-Malthusian regime that emerged in the course of industrialization, in which growth in income per capita took place, but still a huge spike occurred in population growth, and ultimately the modern growth regime that was triggered by the onset of the demographic transition and the freeing of the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population. So it is critical to understand the forces that operated in the Malthusian Epoch. And in contrast to the conventional wisdom, the book is pushing the idea that the Malthusian Epoch is characterized by important dualism, stagnation along with dynamism. Stagnation in living standards, income per capita fluctuate tremendously over a prolonged period of time, life expectancy fluctuation in a very narrow range of 25 to 40, but then great dynamism. Slow technological progress, slow population growth, slow adaptation, but over 300,000 year period, these processes are gaining momentum. The size of the population of the world from the eve of the Neolithic Revolution to the eve of the Industrial Revolution is increasing 400-fold. Technological progress is moving from Stone Age technology to steam engine technology, and humans are adapting to the new technological environment. And this Malthusian dynamism is the force that ultimately triggered the transition from stagnation to growth. So when we think about the Malthusian pressure naturally affected the size of the population, but at the same time, the composition of the population. Traits that were complementary to the growth process generated higher income and consequently higher reproductive success. And they became more and more prevalent in the population. And this adaptation process raised the prevalence of complementary traits to the growth process, reinforced the process, and ultimately the takeoff from stagnation to growth. So during the Malthusian Epoch, the size of the population and the composition of the population affected this technological progress, but at the same time, technological progress affected the size of the population and the adaptation of the population. And consequently, technological progress accelerated, as I said, from Stone Age technology to steam engine technology, and ultimately, the change was so rapid that technological progress outpaced biological reproduction. That's the point in which we see the growth in income per capita and a dramatic increase in population growth. But ultimately, this interaction is reaching a tipping point, and this tipping point reflects the fact that the environment is changing so rapidly. So individuals start to invest in the human capital of their children so as to allow them to be able to navigate this rapidly changing technological environment. And this decline in fertility that occurs due to the fact that resources constraints are binding and investment in human capital must come on the account of fertility is basically freeing the growth process from the counterbalancing effect of population. The growth process is now fueled by technological progress, human capital formation, and the decline in fertility. Now, when we think about the march of humanity up to this point, it appears that shattering and dreadful events such as World War I, World War II, Spanish flu, atrocities in between, and the Great Depression, a devastating effect on humanity only in the short run. But in fact, in the long run, they did not affect the grand arc of human development. Living standard swiftly recovered from many of these catastrophes. But the question naturally is, will climate change derail humanity from this relentless march? Will climate change be, in fact, the most devastating event of all that will derail humanity forever after? And the book, in fact, offers a very hopeful look, every very helpful outlook about the march of humanity. It suggests to us that the Industrial Revolution, that was the catalyst in climatic change, at the same time was the catalyst in the decline in fertility, the catalyst in human capital formation, and the catalyst in the incredible power of innovations. And as a result of it, in fact, this tipping point that has been reached is providing a hopeful outlook for the future, because the decline in fertility will allow us to buy a critical time that will permit us to mitigate the pace of climatic change and will provide us the necessary time for the advancement of revolutionary technologies that would turn this climate change into a fading memory in the decades or perhaps the century to come. So this is the first part of the book. The first part of the book is starting with the emergence of anatomically modern human in Africa 300,000 years ago, marching forward to the present. The second part of the book is in fact reversing the clock. Starts at a contemporary inequality across the globe and asking what are the roots of this global inequality as we see it today. And it starts sort of with the proximate causes of development: physical capital formation, human capital formation, technological progress. But it makes the point that in fact, these variations are not there to explain to us the roots of the inequality across the globe. Namely, the question is why some societies fail to efficiently invest in physical and human capital formation, why societies fail to adopt advanced technologies. And consequently, the book is moving back in human history, trying to peel gradually different layers of influence that affected the inequality that we see today. So we move into deeper roots, institutions and cultural characteristics, and ultimately into the ultimate roots, geography and societal characteristics. So when we think about the fingerprints of institutions, naturally, one can think about the adoption of growth-enhancing inclusive institutions in some regions of the world, and the adoption of growth-retarding extractive institutions in others. Sometimes this adoption occurred at random critical juncture, as occurred in the division of the Korea along the 38th parallel. But in most cases, in fact, institutions evolve gradually in response to economic development. The Neolithic Revolution generated an increase in population density and ultimately the adoption of institutions that can allow cooperation across individuals. Fertile land led into larger population density and the demand for rule of law. Suitability of land for large plantation generated the incentive for the implementation of extractive institutions and ultimately slavery. And the disease environment naturally affected economic development and delayed the adoption of centralized institutions. When we think about institutions, they have tremendous effect, but in fact, there are underlying factors that explain the emergence of institutions. And we move to the discussion of culture. So when we think about the cultural factor, again, we can see the emergence of differential cultural traits across regions. We can think about growth-enhancing cultural traits such as social capital that emerge in northern Italy, and growth-retarding traits such as family ties in the south. And this can perhaps explain to us the Italian divide. But again, cultural traits are rarely manna from heaven. Typically, they evolve and they adapted to the environment in which they emerge. So naturally, the return to human capital affected the predisposition toward child quality. High crop yield affected future-oriented mindset. Climatic volatility and vulnerability affected loss aversion, and plow suitability affected gender biases. So overall, again, the cultural factor has deeper roots. And this leads us into the shadow of geography, namely with those geographical characteristics that had a direct impact on land productivity and human capital formation, but at the same time, indirect impact on the evolution of cultural and institutional characteristics. And if we move in further back in human history, 12,000 years ago, we can ask ourselves how the Neolithic Revolution affected comparative development, resting on the hypothesis of Jared Diamond that perhaps the persistent effect of the technological head start that was associated with the Neolithic Revolution is behind much of the inequality that we see across the globe. So as suggested by Diamond, the transition from hunter-gatherer society to agricultural communities led to the emergence of non-food producing class that was associated with knowledge creation and technological head start. And indeed, variations in the Neolithic Revolution ultimately led to variation in economic prosperity across the globe. But unlike the Diamond hypothesis, this effect dissipated around the year 1500. Namely, the Diamond hypothesis explained significant portion of the variation in economic development till about 1491. But in fact, it explained very few of the variations later on. And this leads us into a further layer of influence. As we peel the layers of influence, ultimately we are reverting back to the place where everything begins, namely the out of Africa hypothesis. We are all originated from Africa, and around 60 to 90,000 years ago, we see the migration of anatomically modern human from Africa. And this migration has a tremendous effect on the distribution of population diversity across the globe and comparative development. So during this migration, departing population carried only a subset of the cultural, phenotypic, behavior, linguistic diversity that existed in parental colonies, and therefore the further people migrated, sequentially, the lower was the degree of diversity. And given the fact that diversity has conflicting effect on development, beneficial effect on creativity and innovations due to cross-fertilization and complementarities in the production process, and adverse effect on mistrust, disagreement about the desirable public goods, ethnic fractionalization. And consequently, in light of these conflicting effects, this suggests to us that there is a ham-shaped relationship between diversity and development. And in fact, evidence is rather striking about this persistent effect of an event that occurred, as I said, 60 to 90,000 years ago on economic development. So overall, when we think about comparative development across the globe today, and we think about the roots of comparative development across the globe, it appears that nearly 90% of the variations in income per capita across the globe can be mapped into deep-rooted factors: institutions, culture, geography, and human diversity. The magnitudes differ, and in fact, each element has a significant power in explaining some of these variations. Political institutions, about 10%, geography, 20 to 30%, the dispersal of anatomically modern humans from Africa, around 25%, etc. But each of them is important for the understanding of economic development today. Now, naturally, if we think about human history, and if we think about the contemporary development, it appears that the impact of institutions is gradually diminishing in the course of economic development because developing countries naturally have the incentive to adopt growth-enhancing institutions. At the same time, the impact of culture is gradually diminishing due to the fact that developing countries are emulating growth-enhancing cultural norms. The adverse effect of geography is mitigated by the diffusion of medical technology, transportation technology, and information technology revolution. But there is only modest convergence in human diversity due to the attachment of individuals to their parental homeland and native culture, and due to the presence of legal barriers to international migration. Now, does it imply that we have historical determinism? Not at all. On the contrary, the insights from the journey of humanity in fact, permits us to design growth-enhancing, country-specific, historic-specific policies that are critical for the ability of humanity to flourish in the decades and in the centuries to come. Education policies that are geared towards social cohesiveness and tolerance in diverse societies are very important, and education policies that are geared towards pluralism in homogeneous societies will be critical. In addition, policies that are fostering growth-enhancing cultural traits, such as a future-oriented mindset in places where land suitability did not lead into the emergence of these particular traits, or again, policies that are fostering gender equality, tolerance, and respect for difference are holding the key to human prosperity.
Wow, thank you so much, Oded. And the way you presented this is exactly the feeling I also got when I read the book. So it's full of energy, and it's really like a thriller. Turning every page, I was eager to continue reading, and I'm not usually a book reader, I must admit. I read papers, but not books typically. And yeah, that same energy comes across when reading the book. So thank you so much. So then what made you write a book, given that you've written dozens of articles published in the top journals of the profession? So why a book now?
So the book reflects my progression as a scholar in the past 3 decades. So over the years, naturally, I was intrigued by the evolution of societies over time. I was intrigued by the inequality that is prevalent across societies. And at the same time, I was intrigued by the mathematics of dynamical systems. And a lot of what I did in my early stages of my career is basically the design of mathematical models and mathematical tools that allows us to better understand how initial conditions affect the long-run trajectory of societies. So over time, I developed a necessary tool for the development of unified growth theory, and I developed an empirical agenda that was trying basically to fortify many of the elements of unified growth theory that at the time where I wrote the theory were not necessarily based on concrete empirical facts. At the moment, we know that in fact, literally each and every building block is well fortified and well established empirically, partly by the research of others and partly by my own research. But it was a process. So about 15 years ago, I was approached by MIT Press, and they asked me if I'm interested in writing a trade book about the vision of unified growth theory. And I was contemplating it for a while, and I felt that in fact, I'm intellectually not ripe yet to do so, because I felt that first I need somehow to write a book that is directed to researchers in the field rather than to the broad audience. So then in fact, ultimately I worked with Princeton University Press, and I wrote my book on unified growth theory that had the seeds of what you see at the moment, but was naturally much less accessible. It was technical, basically brought the theory into the surface with a nice narrative, but nevertheless, it was more technical. And as I said, over the years, I gradually developed a sort of various research agendas that took me ultimately into the out of Africa hypothesis and into an understanding how initial conditions are in fact affecting economic development. I wrote different surveys that ultimately made me feel that in fact I can communicate these complex mathematical thoughts and empirical thoughts into the broad public. And I was gradually engaging in writing the different elements of the book, and here we are.
Amazing. Well, now I need to ask you, what is your favorite part of the book? You covered many years of history, but what is your favorite part?
So this is always a difficult question when you ask about your favorite parent or your favorite child or your favorite article. I think that I like them all. But there is something about about the research agenda and about book structure that I really like, which is really the way that the research was conducted. So when I started this research, as I said, I started by asking myself how initial conditions affect the evolution of society over time. And I realized that, in fact, given few thousand people in Africa, I can basically generate a progression of humanity in which technology is endogenous, prosperity is endogenous, the composition of the human population is endogenous, and this basically progression will take us gradually and deterministically into the Industrial Revolution and into the prosperity that we reach today. It doesn't necessarily imply that the Industrial Revolution would occur in England in 1750, or that will occur in 1750 at all, but there is a certain progression in which, in fact, the transition from stagnation to growth is inevitable. So this was my initial outlook. And then when I started to think about comparative development, I started naturally from the present. And in fact, it started with an earlier research agenda of mine in which I tried to understand what are the barriers in the process of accumulation and in the process of technological adoption. And then I started this research agenda about the role of inequality in the process of development. Inequality is a barrier in the process of human capital formation, physical capital formation, etc. But gradually I moved further and further back in human history into, as I said, back into Africa and back to 60 to 90,000 years ago. So my favorable part of the book is, in fact, the fact that it has two parts. One of them, the first part, is moving forward in time from Genesis to the present. And the second part is taking precisely the opposite course. It started the present, moving into the understanding of colonialism, institutions, culture, geography, and ultimately the out of Africa hypothesis and human diversity. So that's my favorable part.
Cool. What do you think non-economists would like the most?
Well, that's a very good question, and I think that, again, when we think about non-economists, we shouldn't think about a homogeneous group. So it depends what type of non-economist. So I would expect non-economists to be fascinated by different aspects of the book. If I think simply about the educated readers that are not committed to any particular academic discipline, okay? I think they're likely to be intrigued by the long shadow of history. They're likely to be intrigued by the fact that events that occurred hundreds, thousands, and even tens of thousands of years ago are still affecting the wealth of nations. I think that they're likely to be intrigued about this metamorphosis that occurred in the past 2 centuries, this dramatic transformation in living standards that are far from being obvious. And they're likely to be intrigued by the fact that the understanding of the gap in the wealth of nation, as I said, is linked to the identification of these deep-rooted factors in the process of development. So this idea that much of the inequality that we see today was formed very much in the distant past. So this is, I think, the general educated reader. If I think about historians, I think historians are likely to be intrigued by the importance of macro history in the understanding of the journey of humanity. So rather than, so when we think about human history, naturally human history is rich in countless and fascinating details. Mighty civilization that rose and fell, charismatic emperors who led armies to massive conquests and defeats, artists that created enchanting cultural treasure, and philosophers and scientists that advanced our understanding of the universe. But evidently, it is easy to become adrift in these oceans of details. And the beauty of the journey of humanity and the beauty of focusing on macro history is that it allows us to understand the fundamental undercurrents that ultimately govern the transition from stagnation to growth, led into into the transition from stagnation to growth, into this metamorphosis in standard of living, and led into the inequality as we see it today. Now, if you think about mathematicians and physicists, they're likely to be intrigued by the development of unified growth theory. The fact that initial conditions that occurred 300,000 years ago are in fact behind the wheels of change that brought about the transformation in the world economy in the past 200 years and brought about this divergence in the wealth of nations. And if you think about social scientists in general, again, I think that social scientists are likely to be intrigued by the fact that we see the long shadow of history, and by the fact that despite the long shadow of history, there is no historical determinism. Namely, that progressive policies such as gender equality, tolerance, and pluralism are key to human prosperity.
Amazing again. I really enjoyed all the historical anecdotes that you said and you tell in the book. And I'm sure even the general audience will find the book very interesting and very easy to understand, covering all the journey of humankind. And I'm sure that we'll learn something, like I learned about the Malthusian trap a little bit more. But specifically, what did you learn writing this book? Is there any particular thing that you discovered while writing this book?
So I will answer it indirectly. What I discovered is when I wrote a book and when I'm reading the book again and again, and I enjoy every new reading, because I'm sort of drifted into it. I'm telling my wife that when I start to read, I find myself suddenly in chapter 6, in the sense that I want to read something small, and then I'm drawn into the reading. Despite the fact that I am the author, I'm drawn into the reading, and I really like it. So when I look at the book as a whole, what it really clarifies to me is the importance of raising large questions. Because from time to time, I basically, as I was researching different elements of the book, I was going into the study of a person that devoted his lifetime to addressing a certain issue. It was very important for him, but in the end, in the context of the journey of humanity, it appears like a minor footnote that is basically fortifying a sub-element of the big element. So somehow it caused me personally to understand that it's really important to focus on the big questions. Yes, I mean, naturally, I'm very grateful for every individual that is basically fortifying the understanding of the journey of humanity by focusing on every little element. Without it, research would not advance. But the revelation for me was, as I said, to see that the work of a lot of influential individuals in the end is amounted to a footnote. And somehow we need, as researchers, to think about it. And I think in this respect, when you read the journey of humanity, and I think that in every page, you have in some sense open research questions, open intriguing issues to be addressed. You have to keep in mind that somehow when you do research, think about how it will look 50 years from now, 100 years from now, whether it will be entirely forgotten, or whether it is in fact an important building block in the understanding of the journey of humanity. But this is really what I learned from the book in retrospect. I mean, naturally, the building blocks were known to me and the different elements were known to me, and I ultimately unified them over time in a way that is accessible to the public. But what was really revelatory for me is the fact that you have to work on questions that make a difference, and you somehow see the difference when you look at the different elements of the book.
Thank you so much for that. So you already described what you hope certain reader groups would get from the book, but let me rephrase it a bit differently. So if you could choose to give a copy of your book to a specific person or to a specific group of readers, who do you think would benefit most from reading it?
at the moment, the book, I mean, many people were exposed to the drafts of the book, and I'm really it's wonderful to notice that, in fact, different people are enjoying different parts of the book. So I think that, in fact, the book will be wonderful for the general public, any educated person that would like to understand, in fact, our journey. And our journey is really fascinating. It would be fantastic for any students in the field of economics. In fact, I would like to see it as a companion for the course of Introduction to Economics. So before individuals started to basically learn the tool of economics, they should in some sense understand where we come from, how in fact the modern economy came to be, and what are the roots of this dramatic inequality as we see them across the globe. So I can think about historians that will benefit, mathematicians and physicists, I mean, scientists in general, people that deal with cultural evolution, people that have general interest in popular science, and educated people in general. And in the context of economists, as I said, I think and I hope that this will become a pillar in the education, in the curriculum of individuals that are studying economics, in the sense that this I wouldn't like to think about it as a precondition, because I would like it to be done voluntarily, but I think that this can really enrich individuals enormously and can benefit the economic discipline as a whole. That's my hope.
Thank you so much. I mean, it will definitely be on the syllabus for our growth course here at Monash University. Now, I was reading the book, in fact, the PDF you sent me, as I was traveling through Australia from north to south, from Darwin, of all places, to Adelaide. And so I was going through the outback of Australia. And somehow a question came to my mind, given that there is lots of Aboriginal settlements in that area, and Aboriginals, many of them, seem to have a very close connection with country, with the land they live on, and do not seem to be keen to participate in economic growth as we see it. So I'm wondering, do you think that all cultures perceive growth the same way, and should they?
Yeah, so that's a fascinating question, and clearly various societies may perceive the growth process very differently. Some society may not view technological and cultural change as progress at all. But my viewpoint is a bit different here. I think about the history of the globe, and I think about the history of humanity. And I do think that moving from life that was defined by Hobbes as nasty, brutish, and short, to the life in which we live today is progress. I think moving from a life that existed only a few centuries ago, in which 1/4 of newborn did not make it to their first birthday, 1/2 of newborn did not make it to adulthood, numerous women, perhaps 1/10 of them, perish in each childbirth. Life expectancy rarely exceeded 40. Life in which, in fact, an economic crisis did not lead into belt tightening, but in fact led into mass starvation and extinction. Moving from this life into a life in which, in fact, the death of a child is an incredible tragedy, and life in which life expectancy is hovering around 80, in life in which, even in the presence of inequality, there is literally no starvation across the globe, I view it as progress. Again, I appreciate and I respect the views of some that would like to remain in their traditional setup and would like to view technological change in a different way and not necessarily as progress. But nevertheless, I'm holding the view, and it's a view, that in fact, progress did occur in the course of human history. Technological change was not only a change, but it was technological progress. And this what allowed, as I said, allowed us to view the death of a child as an unusual tragedy, whereas the death of a child 200-300 years ago was a common phenomenon. I think this is progress.
Oded, thank you so much. I must say, I was looking forward to this for weeks now, that we would talk about your book. And again, I very much enjoyed reading it, more than pretty much any book I read in the last 10 years. So really thank you for writing it. And I sincerely hope that you will get a broad readership all around the world. And I know you told me the book will come out in 28 different languages at once, which sounds crazy. It shows also the hope the publisher has in reaching people all around the globe. So thank you so much for writing that book and for giving us your time today and sharing your energy and your hope for humanity. And let me repeat again, so the book is out on Amazon already and will come out in print in the next few days. And the title is The Journey of Humanity, The Origins of Wealth and Inequality. Thank you, Oded, and see you soon in person. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. It was a delightful event.
Thank you so much, Oded, and thank you, Sascha, for running the interview. I'll see you at the next one.